And our next speaker is Selina Heppell. Selina really specializes in assessment of long live species, from turtles to rockfish, but she's gotten now a little bit more involved in sort of local fisheries management and is a member of the SSC, of the Pacific Fisheries Management Council, and is also reaching out to some local Oregon communities. And I think she's going to talk today some about those projects, scaling up, scaling down, linking community-based stewardship to the needs of fisheries management. Selina Heppell from Oregon State University.
Thanks, Liz, and I want to thank the organizers for the symposium. I think we've had a lot of excellent talks, and particularly discussion in between talks. It's a funny thing for me as an ecologist and assessment type person to be in this session on community-based management and what's happening in local systems. And so I only put my name on this just so that I'm not, that they know who to blame later. But I got a lot of input from Lisa Cobb, from Jim Golden, and from several fishermen in the Port Orford area putting this talk together to give you some information about Port Orford and the work they're doing. So, actually, before I start this, I want to go ahead and just run a little bit of a movie here. We have no sound for this, but first of all, Port Orford almost never has weather like this, but we'll ignore that. But Port Orford is a small fishing community on the southern Oregon coast. It's a fantastic place to visit and work, and it's really been a great opportunity for me as a scientist to have this this community that's very open to working with scientists, to local stewardship, and so on. And I'm going to give you a little bit more information about it. I think they took all of these pictures actually on the 4 good weather days that happened last year. This is a small boat fleet. I'm mostly doing live fishing for rockfish. And then the most interesting and intriguing thing about Port Orford is they don't have a harbor. They actually have to launch their boats with a crane. Okay? And what that means is that it limits the boat lengths to about 12 meters. So you can't have big boats in Port Orford. There's no trawlers in Port Orford, and it's mostly a lot of hook and line fishing, and then some long line fishing and crabbing. All right. So let me just stop that, just so you can watch more of the movie later if you want to. And I hate the movie thing. Where is it?
From beginning will get you upper left-hand corner.
Upper left-hand corner. Got it. I still haven't learned the new PowerPoint. Okay.
I'll change it by the time you do it.
I know. All right. So, Port Orford, as I said, is on the southern Oregon coast, and so here's the thing to keep in mind is that it's a very small community in an area of jurisdiction for the council that's a very large area. And so this idea that the theme I wanted to focus on for this talk is this theme of scale, and that wonderful, really cool things can be happening at very small scales, which may or may not translate up to the larger scale, but can certainly help with some of the questions we have about how to do ecosystem-based management, and also potentially serve as models. All right, so the town size is 1,200. Industry is just fishing, really. There's a little bit of timber harvest nearby. Crab, sablefish, used to be salmon. Halibut also has been cut out a fair bit because of the closures, the rockfish conservation area closures. Tuna fishing, and then this live fishery, which is the one I'm most interested in, fishing for the nearshore rockfish species, greenling and cabezon, for the restaurants down in the Bay Area. So they actually catch fish alive. If the fish has a swim bladder, they actually puncture that swim bladder degas the fish, keep it in tanks, and then the fish are trucked down to the Bay Area for selling in restaurants. And the revenue down there from fishing is about $4 million a year. Port Orford, even though it's a small fleet in a small town, accounts for a large proportion of the total landings for several of those rockfish species, and also cabezon and even lingcod. Now, POORT is the Port Orford Ocean Resource Team, and this is a bit of a poster child for ecosystem-based fisheries management thinking on the West Coast. And when you talk to folks down there, it's really interesting that fishermen sort of automatically think in ecosystem-based management terms, I think. Aaron Longton was telling me, sometimes this species goes up and that species goes down and things switch around, and there's a lot of, when the wind blows this way, we catch this, and when it blows that way, we catch that. And so they're sort of all in tune with some of those processes that we haven't necessarily quantified, but they actually know a lot about, and so I'm learning a lot from them. Now, PORT's vision is to have a sustainable fishery on the reef that utilizes the best science and local experiential knowledge for the community to make local fishery management decisions that sustain and improve habitat or population base of the fish, provide high quality, high value seafood products, and support the economic viability of the Port Orford community. Now, that theme of that it's not just the fishery that we're concerned about the whole fishing community, is very big in the port way of thinking. And the motivation behind this is probably the same motivation that lots of people in lots of communities have, which is that we have coast-wide assessments, and those coast-wide assessments give us some indication of what species are abundant, what species aren't abundant, which ones we can catch lots of, which ones we can't, and then what the guys see out there is something quite different. And I'm sure this happens everywhere. Everybody thinks that, we have a ton of species X, but it actually could be true in Port Orford because they do have some unique habitat structures and so on there. But really what a big motivator for this kind of stewardship idea and community-based management is because they want to catch the redfish. And they want quotas that allow them to catch the redfish. All right, so what they've developed is a stewardship plan, and that stewardship plan has goals and objectives in it, defining a stewardship area, developing an access plan, creating an integrated research plan, monitoring, and then developing actually infrastructure. A research station is on their agenda, and they've been working on that, and then fostering partnerships and developing funding sources. So they actually have a stewardship plan that's quite detailed, and you can see it on the web. But this is what's most fascinating, the stewardship area that they've outlined. And the thing to keep in mind is that this is very much a bottom-up process. So this stewardship plan and area designation, well, let's not call it designation, lines on a map, have really come from the fishermen themselves and from the community members, not just a few fishermen from a few sectors. So this stewardship plan is really interesting. The area, you'll see, goes, so here's the 3-mile limit, here's the state water limit. So the stewardship plan goes out to about 12 miles or so, and that is what we might call, just to borrow the phrase from the tribes, the usual and accustomed fishing areas for the community. Okay. The fishermen said, hey, we like salmon, we fish salmon, so we better have our stewardship area extend into the watershed. And that's pretty unique for a marine fishery to be thinking about, okay? But you can see, those of you particularly who are involved in governments, what a nightmare this is. I mean, think about it. we've got an area that's extending beyond, from state waters into federal waters. We've got this area that's going on into terrestrial systems where you have a whole nother slew of state and federal agencies involved. A lot of the land up here is BLM land and so on. So it's a big idea, but I think they understand that it's a pretty difficult thing to actually go from lines on a map to something that would actually constitute some sort of governmental regulations. All right. So why do they want a stewardship area? Well, this is straight off their website. They see it as a wise investment for fishing, and I'm just going to highlight a few things in this statement here. Creating a platform to share responsibility and decision-making, to conserve biological integrity, to facilitate research, and for long-term stabilization. Okay, so there's some very key words in there that I think give you a sense of sort of the motivation, what they're trying to do down there. And they have had a lot of ups and downs, just like a lot of fisheries in a lot of areas. And they see this stewardship plan as a way to settle things out a bit. They do have a marine reserve proposal, and in fact, Port Orford's marine reserve proposal is one of only 2 on the Oregon coast that were accepted and put forward as pilot reserve sites, recommended as pilot reserve sites by the Ocean Policy Advisory Council in Oregon. It's not a big reserve. And it's here in this area we call Redfish Rocks, and then they propose to have a marine protected area that would extend out to the 3-mile limit. Now, the marine reserve process in Oregon is a whole different talk, if not symposium. Because this proposal for this site was actually the result of 7 or 8 years of discussion, development of a stewardship plan, development of an idea for spatial management, they were able to actually put forth a proposal that the Ocean Policy Advisory Council found desirable, acceptable, and so on for a pilot site. All right. Now, I'm not going to talk too much more about Port Orford itself. I just want to bring up a few things that kind of tie together some of the themes that we've been talking about for the last 2 days. So I see small-scale local information as useful for large-scale regional research for management, potentially, because of the opportunities for ground truthing, for understanding mechanisms, particularly some of the things that Ann Hollywood talked about in terms of connectivity and local variability. Oops. Multiple, and then also potential, I think, for looking at effects of fishing on small scales. Okay? But maybe it's not terribly useful for the larger scale picture because the variability in the system may make the Port Orford area rather unique. And therefore not really relevant at a coast-wide scale. Or the isolation and physical restrictions in resource use activities there may make it a unique system from a social and economic standpoint. So that scaling up, we have to sort of weigh these things out and figure out, all right, well, what's really relevant at the small scale effort or in these monitoring plans that they're developing when we try to apply that information to the larger scale questions for ecosystem-based management on the West Coast. The Pacific Marine Conservation Council worked with a bunch of folks on the coast here with this idea of cape-to-cape management, and Port Orford was involved with that. The argument was made that the coast-wide assessments and management were failing to account for large differences in fishing effort, impact, and dependence on resources that are, in other words, California areas are much different from Oregon areas, are much different from Washington areas, and so on and so forth, and that the physical variation actually in the system actually creates natural biogeographical barriers. And we have, not barriers, let's call them boundaries. And the major capes seem to be locations where the data are starting to suggest that some species at least have local smaller stock structure because of those. But it was brought up, and repeatedly at these meetings, that doing assessments and management at that smaller spatial scale would actually require us to triple or quadruple our current data collection and analysis efforts, and that this current stock assessment would have a really hard time with that if there wasn't a massive increase in data collection. So one thing that we can think about, though, is what are some ways that we can work better with the data we have, or the data that we can get relatively easily. And the cool thing about the stewardship idea and what's happening in Port Orford is that these guys really want to collect data for us. They want to put devices on their boats that can collect sea surface temperature and dissolved oxygen information and pH information. They want to tag fish. They want to do acoustic tracking. They really want to get involved. Now, maybe it's because really the weather is so bad in Port Orford that they're sitting around a lot thinking, oh my God, yeah, look at all these things we can do. But I'll get back to that, because there's actually few enough good fishing days that getting these guys to do research on those fishing days can be problematic. Okay. Anyway, but I do think we can think about how to utilize local boats and local expertise to get at some of the finer scale information that we're looking for. What about this idea of local stock assessments? Well, maybe we can, but we'll have to come up with different tools, I think. Okay, we certainly can't treat any of those stocks as closed. Even ones that are fairly sedentary. You have ontogenetic shifts going on in and out of the area. You've got movement, connectivity issues, and so on. You really would need to have some information on input and output to that region, as well as local production information. Okay, so that's somewhere down the road. And they keep talking about that. They keep saying, well, Selina, why don't you just do a stock assessment on cabezon in Port Orford? And I'm like, oh, no. But I do think that we can get some interesting information together if we work together. The fishermen know a lot more about the habitat that's out there until we get the funding and time to do detailed sonar mapping of everything. They're a good resource on where the rocks are and where they're not. Identification of de facto reserves, areas where people don't fish for one reason or another. Seasonal movements. They know a lot about seasonal movements. A lot more than I do. Sample collection, like I said, they are interested in collecting samples and being involved with that, and tagging and monitoring. The stewardship plan that they put together includes collaborative science plan and a local monitoring plan. And Jim Golden's worked on this quite extensively. And they've got all of the right components in that plan. Consultation, selecting candidate projects, carrying out projects, and it's all circular, so we have this feedback going on and so on and so forth. So they're coming up with all the right elements. It's just a matter of, do they have the funding and the support from the larger system to really make it happen. I'm doing a very small-scale tagging project, mostly, really I would call it an experimental collaborative tagging program, where it's funded by Sea Grant, and I'm working with a student there, and we went down and we asked the fishermen, where do you think we should tag fish? Where do you think the fish go? How do you want to do this? And so instead of the scientists going down and saying, you will fish here, and you will fish there, and you will do this, and you will do that, it was much more of a two-way street of them telling me what questions they had, me telling them what was feasible and not feasible, what we could potentially get if we got 5% return, 1% return, and so on with our tags. The benefits of this, of course, were that fishermen were involved with the development and execution of the science. And they're involved now. In fact, they have their own permits for tagging their discards during normal fishing operations, in addition to the chartered trips that I'm doing to tag fish. And then, just kind of coincidentally, we're starting to collect movement data, some movement between their proposed marine reserve site and their primary fishing site. So that's going to help somewhere down the road, assuming that we get enough data to do something with it. But the problems, there's problems with this too. Bob Francis likes to call this area the area where it blows like snot. And what that means is that you can be sitting in port for weeks at a time and not be able to get out. When conditions are good enough for those small boats to get out, they don't tend to fish in the same place. And sometimes they can't go to a very specific location. So you have to come up with a sampling regime that is flexible enough to deal with that uncertainty about when you're actually going to be able to get out and collect data and where you're actually going to be able to collect it. Well, talk about a scientist's nightmare. That's it right there. Permitting, well, permitting's been a serious issue for me. Mostly, for whatever reason, it's easier for me to get a permit to kill fish in Alaska than in Oregon. And unknown participation in data quality, always an issue when you're bringing in sort of citizens-based science. You have to find ways to make sure that the data that you're getting are usable and are actually going to be helpful. All right, what I want to finish up with is coming back to some of the themes we started this whole thing with Jake's talk yesterday. We have some challenges, and I want to tie those challenges to what small-scale local efforts might be able to do to help us with those. All right, so this challenge of needing to understand all forcers. Well, it's possibly achievable at small scales, really, and that collaborative research actually allows a true integration of social, physical, and biological forces, I think. Large scale, it's really hard to do. But then there's the limitation of, can you scale up? Can you take those patterns, those positive step forward, and actually make them work at the larger regional management scale? Another challenge, need to understand connectivity and interactions. Well, most ecologists will tell you that small-scale monitoring and experiments are really the only way to establish cause and effect. Okay, and so again, we have scaling issues and assuring rigor issues, but small scale efforts may be the way to go. Accounting for the full footprint of fishery effects. Local stewardship promotes collaborative research and information sharing and full accounting of information. But there's a limitation of identifying the impacts of mobile versus more sedentary fisheries. We have this nice fishery, this live fish fishery that's very sedentary, but there's also fishermen coming into the area from surrounding communities, and so how do you account for that? The need for participatory and inclusive governance and integrated management across user groups. Local efforts are going to be far more successful at multiple stakeholder participation, potentially, than large-scale efforts, and really consensus building. It takes time, but it can happen in a smaller room with fewer people, and where everybody has something at stake in that local community. And so there's kind of it's not just I'm looking out for my own interests, it's I'm looking out for my community's interests. And that really changes things in the discussion. And then finally, the need for adaptive management. Local monitoring of biological and physical conditions can potentially allow very rapid response and having sort of almost a reactionary fishery. You see a change that is an indicator, I'm not saying what that is, but is an indicator that something is not the way you want it to be. And at the smaller scale, you can actually potentially have behavior change fairly rapidly. Whereas at the larger regional scale, you have to wait until the next assessment and the next management cycle and so on and so forth. Funding, of course, is an issue there, though. So what are the options for Port Orford? Well, we can do nothing for Port Orford. We can give them a pat on the back. And Port can continue its efforts to work on marketing, so they want to market those seafood products as coming from sustainable practices, okay, with their stewardship area. They want to continue to do local monitoring and continue participating in council processes the way they have been, but they're forced then to work only with small grants and so on. We can find ways to reward local efforts. Okay, we can give them special treatment. if we want to call it that. Maybe those would be exceptions to closures, maybe community quota. That's kind of this, holy grail thing out there. There's obviously a lot of issues associated with making that happen. And then maybe we can focus more on this idea of this string of pearls up the West Coast, promoting local stewardship and monitoring in key locations on the coast. People have suggested that Oregon's Watershed Council model could be adapted for coastal systems, and the Pacific States Marine Fisheries Commission, I think, could potentially promote that and be the glue that brings these different small communities doing local stewardship activities together. All right, so, and finally, just scaling down. We talked all about scaling up, but there's also a scaling down issue. Local stewardship actually provides increased opportunity for communication of management needs, procedures, and limitations to the communities, to the people working there. And then that data sharing can really provide resource users with useful information on regional scale forcing processes and so on. But they need to know, where do we fit in? Where do our efforts fit into this larger picture? All right, things to ponder as we finish up today. The common solution to scaling problems in ecology and economics and other fields are to do a hierarchical sort of approach where you have high resolution, high intensity at small scale, and then you work your way up after you determine connectivity and the relevance and how those things are connected together. But is community-based, ecosystem-based management really feasible within that larger context? I'm not sure. Maybe we can discuss that. And doing more with what we have, finding ways to work with the locals, I think is really important. Thank you very much.
Should we take one question before we move to the panel here? Question?
Can you attribute some of the success of Port Orford to maybe the lack of diversity in the fisheries there? It's all small boats, or do you contribute harder in places?
Yeah. Yeah, and I do, okay, so the question was, is some of the success because the scale also applies to the numbers and types of fisheries that are there and the lack of diversity because of that small scale. And yes, I think that's true. You don't have big trawlers, you don't have big crab boats and so on in that area. And that's a struggle that they've had all along. Here we are, we're this small community, we have all these great ideas, but we're sort of insular too. And so maybe that scaling up doesn't work too well. But, some of those ideas and things that have worked for them in terms of how they communicate with each other, certainly, and make decisions, I think are applicable to other areas.
So shall we get our panel up here? So I think our two panelists will take questions on communities and governance here. Jay?
Question for both Mary and Selene. I'm sure they've heard the comment that big governments often make of these really great projects. The transaction costs are really high, and that makes it not attractive to use this as the national model for big countries. How much of the high transaction costs are the fact that these are early attempts to do something really ambitious, and over time the transaction costs of doing this in new places will be less and less? Now, how much of the high transaction costs is that's just what you have to do to get good governance?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good question about transaction costs. I think here we had the luck of having the salmon ecosystem-based process start first, and that is an interesting origination. It came before the listing, so before the Endangered Species Act was invoked. The environmental and business community roundtable in this region said, we have to get ahead of this, we have to do something and get in front of the listings that were coming. And there are 100 cities in this basin. So this was mayors and counties and the state and the feds and the tribes. There are 21 treaty tribes that have very strong legal clout here. So they started that. It was really bottoms up in anticipation of a federal hammer that they knew was coming. So, and then when the Bush administration came in, there was discussion of dissolving the whole process because the impression was the federal hammer is gone, why are we doing this? And they decided collectively to stay together because they saw benefits to the work they'd done for 3 years before the Bush administration came in. So I think there are absolutely costs, but if a community, and I've heard this from the other case studies, if they, once they've worked together for 3 or 4 or 5 years, they realize that there are many reasons to be talking and discussing, and so if one of the hammers or the carrots goes away, they had enough incentive, I guess, to stay together, because the real stick that was keeping them there, people thought, was eased, and they still stayed engaged. So I think that was a good test for this community here, and they kind of made it through, and now they're broadening their scope, so I don't know how those transaction costs will bear out. We'll have to see.
I wouldn't speak to the whole ecosystem-based management thing that's being attempted in Port Orford, but I can speak to the marine reserve process that happened down there. And I actually think that Port Orford showed the rest of the state that this is not something you can do in 18 months with no money. Period. And I think that was a really important example to show that you can get a good plan with community consensus, but it's not free and it takes a long time. Yeah, so I think those examples are really good, even if the big picture never quite comes together the way they'd like it to.
Another question?
So, and towards the end, Mary, you talked about sort of splitting apart the sound to meet different ecosystem service objectives, which strikes me as a zoning sort of issue. And then it also occurred to me, when Selina showed this string of pearls, whether that could sort of be extended to local communities sort of deciding this is what we want our coastline to be about, whether it be fishing, whether it be biodiversity. So I was just wondering what you thought, how well that idea of zoning to meet perhaps multiple objectives has played out on the people side of things.
Yeah, zoning is a really nasty word in a lot of people's views, and but I think the spatial, the way that we're starting to talk about this for Puget Sound, where you might have different roles played by different subregions within the area, only works if you first have done the what are your objectives for the whole region part of the work, because otherwise you have no check against the bottom up. What if they all want to be the shellfish factory, or what if they all want to be the metro natural part, which could happen. So I think if you have the broad agreement on objectives for the whole ecosystem first, then at least you have a kind of a decision rule you could put in place for, okay, what are the roles going to be, and there would be a negotiation for sure, because I think if you kept it unbounded, I would be skeptical. And then whether or not it really will turn into zoning per se, and how that will be implemented is going to be another big, tough discussion.